Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. Too often, government corruption around the world is seen as the normal cost of doing business, but it is not a victimless crime, as the toll it takes on populations is immense, from the quality of life to personal safety. While some may believe there is little that can be done, Transparency International, a global organization, has made it their mission to expose corruption around the world and develop policies and strategies that fight against corruption. Fighting government corruption. That issue next. Joining me today from Berlin is Kinda Hattar, Regional Advisor for the Middle East and North Africa for Transparency International. Kinda, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Let me start off with this. It would probably be a reality that most people know that corruption exists in most countries around the world. And so it would not be a surprise for people to hear about the existence of corruption. Where people seem not to be aware of, or maybe that concerned about, depending upon where you are, is the implications of corruption and the effects that it has on various nations, as well as global consequences. Can you speak a little bit about what are the consequences of corruption, which the IMF and the World Bank has said runs into the trillions of dollars in terms of costs to economies? Speak a little bit about that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity again. And I would like to start by saying this year is the year of reporting on the Sustainable Development Goal 16 under the SDGs, UN SDG agenda, which speaks to peace, security, and stability of nations. And under that pillar, we have the main component of fighting corruption, because corruption is identified as one of the main reasons nationally, regionally, and globally that affects people's life and the right to life. And we know that corruption falls into so many forms that it can cross boundaries and cross borders, and also allow the corrupt to operate in different regions and different areas in the world, which can result in moving assets, in luxury of the corrupt, in safe havens. And it's all by exploiting nations. And conflicts do exist nationally, and we see that also there are beneficiaries or war, let's say war impact on the level and the lines of corruption that go around the world.
Staying with the Sustainable Development Goals for a minute, which comes out of the United Nations, but one thing that has come up is the notion of how do other institutions address the issue of corruption. I know this is not your area, but for example, the Paris Club just forgave billions of dollars in Somalia, which is listed as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. So it seems as though that with corruption, there may not be a sense of accountability. So what do institutions such as IMF and the World Bank have to do in order to also hold countries accountable when they give nations like that money, including nations within North Africa as well as in the Middle East? What role do they play in the notion of accountability when it comes to corruption?
You know, there are several things that we need to look at when we speak about how much the international interference within national jurisdictions or national policies or on national economies are. In a lot of cases, we see there is a national pushback on, for example, a lot of the sanctions, or maybe a lot of the conditions that those organizations put on those countries in order to get loans or to get funds or to get grants. This conditionality sometimes plays a role in pushing national agendas to fight corruption. But we really need to have the buy-in of the countries and the political will of the country to actually fight corruption, and not just because we want them to respond to sanctions or to conditions. And I think this is where the whole system of granting help or aid or giving even by international donors to those countries in North Africa or the Middle East should come with the agreement that there should be actually a buy-in nationally on fighting corruption. And that means there are also things that we need to take into consideration. Working in the region for the past 12 years on this particular issue and in depth, we also see that sometimes you have a lot of obstacles in these countries. You can say, come and frame a legal framework. You can have a very beautiful high standard, international standard of fighting corruption in a country, or a law that is very nice and unique, but you have so much in terms of obstacles in mainstreaming that or implementing that into the national agendas and the practices, especially when we're speaking about public sector corruption, because our corruption perception index looks at the corruption in the public sector and not on different other actors in the country. So these challenges are not sometimes taken into consideration. For example, we spoke about the SDGs, and we know the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, or before that, the Millennia Agenda has always put milestones of 1, 2, 5, 6 years. But you can see that, for example, in the region, we have different economies, we have different capacities, we have, for example, countries that are really rich, like in the Gulf, where they can put sometimes systems in place, like they can use technology, access to information through portals, for example, and give access to so many services that can, for example, prevent petty bribes, for example, because this is a service provider. But while other countries are suffering and they are poorer and they can't install this, even with the grants, you have a different system. So the expectations of delivery and implementation of these conditions should be taken into place in a better realistic agenda.
One of the things when it comes to corruption is that your organization depends upon people reporting corruption. But one of the challenges there is the blowback against someone who might report corruption. So, how difficult is it to, let's say, root out corruption in the Middle East as well as North Africa because of the various governance structures there, some of which are authoritarian? So, how difficult is it for a person, let's say, to come to your organization, Transparency International, to report corruption and not be in fear of retaliation?
Well, some of the countries have whistleblower protection agendas, but still the culture is not like, before we go into a barrier of somebody coming forward to report corruption, is how you can actually deal with the culture of reporting, because the culture of reporting also links to the political situation of the countries, of also the various conflicts and dictatorships and regimes that were in place, maybe now more open in some and more closed in another. So the culture of reporting corruption is something that we need to work on in order for people to come forward. In addition to having legal frameworks to report corruption, but also be safe and not be sanctioned. We also have tribal societies. We have societies that are very, very close to each other. So it might be not that the corrupt would be the one that is sanctioning the whistleblower. It would be his tribe or his family or somebody who has benefits with other, corrupt that is linked to that person. So the sanctions might come socially and not legally, for example, or like, the blowback on those whistleblowers would come from the society rather than only from the system. So there needs to be a lot of consideration, and it differs because sometimes even dealing with the Middle East and North Africa as one block is also not fair. Yes, there are so many common things that link the region. However, you really see maybe a whistleblower coming forward freely, maybe in Indonesia, while now after the regime change, but still now there is also a kickback on that in Tunisia. However, in Egypt, it might not be possible. Maybe in Jordan, it is better situated. In Palestine, a bit better. So there are mechanisms, there are anti-corruption agencies that are in place. However, we really need to also give those whistleblowers some kind of assurance that even if they come forward, it will be dealt with. So, do we have systems in place to deal with the corrupt, with any corruption case? Because we have seen in many of the anti corruption agencies that are doing their jobs, maybe also to the extreme and in good faith, and they have the resources. But then when it hits the judicial system, we don't have independence of the judiciary. So it gets blocked on the judicial level and it doesn't go forward. And then the corrupt is not sanctioned. So, how do we build the trust for those whistleblowers to come forward if we need to really work on developing the systems that will sanction the corrupt at the end?
I want to go back for a moment to the the intervention of other institutions, but also other countries, because given that many of these countries, whether it's North Africa or the Middle East, they also play a geopolitical role when it comes to, let's say, rivalry between the United States, China, Russia, people like that. And United States has turned a blind eye from time to time to corruption in other nations, providing that it plays a role in its geopolitical strategy. So, how do you deal with that question in terms of other countries who may, let's say, turn a blind eye and in fact, give tacit approval of what's going on because they play a bigger role in their strategy?
Any conflict would create opportunity for external intervention in any country, and that is unfortunate. It is opportunity for many to take use of, for example, exploiting resources, exploiting or even putting hand on resources. We have also all these opportunity of the reconstruction after a war, which can allow for a lot of corruption, especially if those companies come from abroad. But I think corruption keeps formulating in different ways, and we always have to be very ready to try and address those forms of corruption. So we have a lot of for example, anti-bribery acts in countries of origin. So if, for example, a company is exploiting a certain resource in a country where they have open field because of a conflict, then you can actually go and prosecute these in their national and mother company land or country. So there are laws in places that are developing as corruption forms are developing. So this is always something that we need to keep in mind. However, we also need to keep in mind that with weak systems nationally, you can't do so much on an international level. We need to build the national systems to be very strong in order to combat forms of corruption, even with external interference or external exploitation, or going into a country and basically be part of corruption acts. Unless we do that, unless there is a stronger integrity system, national integrity systems in those countries, we cannot fight that.
I do want to raise the point. I know here in the United States, in New York, for example, you know of the trials and tribulations of the Republican nominee for president and how much he has to pay out now in fines in order to appeal. But that kind of corruption is also being it's being supported almost by people within the real estate industry here in New York City, people like Kevin O'Leary, who are coming out and saying what Trump did is not bad and we shouldn't do things like that. So the question I have for you, because it goes back to the notion of culture, because that's a culture that's here in New York. So how do you begin to shift the culture away from one of corruption and looking to do business without that? I mean, how does that happen and how difficult is that to change?
We need to work so much on the educational systems because sometimes it is hard to do change on generations that have been comfortable with forms of corruption. However, the new generations should be more resilient to that, more and should work towards better understanding that yes, I will not be engaged in nepotism. I will not be engaged. We call it vitamin wow, which is wasta, which is basically nepotism in Arabic, a form of using your connections in order to get anything you need. For example, that's one of examples that we can fight by looking at how our systems, our educational system, can actually build that culture again, or rebuild the trust also of the generations. We can see a trend. We have seen that all these changes since the so-called Arab Spring, that the new generation, the one that had enough and the one that is actually suffering, are the ones that started to say no, and we want that change. And somehow, at some point in history, there in the past decade, there has been attempts of even the old guards to take over such a revolution and take the voice of the people towards fighting corruption and more transparency. But I think this is why the region is still unstable, because there is this actual ask that we really need more integrity systems. We need to fight corruption. It's not yet. It's not yet in place. It will take time, and changing the culture does not come overnight. It really requires, when we say a generation, it requires probably a decade, 2 decades, until we actually build some sort of a base for a proper culture that is against corruption.
I know one of the countries that you would deal with is Saudi Arabia, and they have supposedly made some changes in the notion of corruption, particularly in the construction sector, to root out corruption. Could you say more about that and talk about the region in general? Because I think in one of your reports, you have stated that corruption or the decreasing of corruption has not changed that much since 2017. So, could you talk a little bit about what's going on in various countries to change the culture, such as Saudi Arabia? Uh, Now, the killing of Khashoggi notwithstanding, so that will always be a stain, and we understand that. But if you can talk about what is taking place in some of these countries that provides you with optimism that perhaps in the next generation or next 10 to 20 years, that you'll see a different type of culture when it comes to business practices, government practices as it pertains to corruption.
I'll go back to a point where I said that the region is different. So if I would put it in blocks, I will also be unfair, because there are also national agendas now that are splitting from the cross-border or neighboring countries' agenda, because they're starting to realize that there needs to be proper national strategies to fight corruption. And I think in the past few years, we can see that the Gulf is advancing in many ways. And when I speak about the public sector, which is the most the sector that we can actually measure, because the business sector is somehow it is not easy to measure it. However, when it links to the public sector and the relationship with the public sector, for example, in the procurement interactions, then we can actually measure how much it is transparent, how much it is equal opportunity, how Was it free of corruption acts like bribery or so on? Or in the investment sector, this is where it cross-cuts with the public sector. Then we can say there has been laws, and I'm saying this again, legal frameworks are very important. But then we need to differentiate between what is legal and what is ethical. Sometimes there are legal acts and everybody is acting legal. However, is it ethical? And corruption sometimes hits that ground where you need to actually say, so this is corruption, but in many ways, it is not illegal. The system allows it. How do we change the system to realize that this is non-ethical and should be non-legal because it is a form of corruption? And in countries where they have good economic power, they have the budget to implement projects. They have the budget to influence some processes. We see that there is some sort of development. We can see in Kuwait, for example, now, and it's one of our countries to watch in the Corruption Perception Index. And we have seen a jump for Kuwait because there was some sort of a national agenda, but that was a participatory agenda where they had civil society along with the private sector, along with the government, along with the parliament, that they sat down and they had this roadmap for reform, and they said, we want to do it. There was a participatory way. What we see is a problem in the region. If we have a strong government that has the will to do some reforms, civil society, for example, in the Gulf does not exist. The freedom, independent civil society. We have civil society, but how independent are they? Do they have the power of holding the power into account? The social accountability is one of the main things that we work on, and we say the voice of the people should be heard. Are they protected? So this, for example, in the Gulf is one of the weaknesses of not having those freedoms, and also the freedom of the media and an independent media voice and investigative journalists that can work freely to open up corruption cases or speak about it. While we see, on the other hand, the government or the people in power working towards legalize, legal frameworks and processes in places. So, for example, that's one area in the Gulf. While in other areas where we see, for example, in Lebanon, civil society is can operate and working, but there is a failure of the system, the failure of the government. They have a political vacuum. They don't have a president. It's a temporary government. There is a lot of sectarianism. And then you have the sectarian also problem in Iraq, where a lot of pull and pushback. But then there is a political will to fight corruption. If we go to North Africa, we had a lot of hope in Tunisia. And all the system in the last 10 years that has been put in place with proper legal frameworks, accountability, civil society, and then out of a sudden, the past year or 2 years ago, since the new president came into place, a lot of these systems has been, let me call it, hijacked or taken away. So there is always an up and down. There are always positives and negatives, but the recommendation is, if you want to fight corruption in any of the countries, you need to have a holistic approach where all stakeholders can take part in fighting corruption. You cannot say, I have the power, I have the money, I can put all these things in place, but then silence the voice of the people or not allow them to speak. Or, for example, have only few people that you would prosecute just to show that you're prosecuting the corrupt, while you don't have a proper judicial system in place that actually goes through a process. When you prosecute a corrupt, you have to have a court case with evidence, and not to just say, we have confiscated the assets of 1, 2, 3, 4 people, we've put them behind bars, but there was not a proper process of prosecuting them. So there are good attempts, there are good initiatives, but there are big gaps in building the trust
Let me ask you
in the
this. Now,
system.
Transparency International is a well regarded organization by nations around the world. And in fact, you know, people like stations like CNBC in America uses your information when it talks about corruption around the world. But you can't do this without allies. And so I want to touch on 2 points, go back to kind of the cultural aspect for a minute. But how do you make people understand what the cost of corruption actually is to their daily lives, not only from a local perspective, but from a global perspective? And how do you get nations like the United States, and other nations may be a little more difficult, but institutions like the IMF and World Bank, how do you hold them accountable for what they're doing that may turn a blind eye or whatever the case may be? So how do you hold them accountable to help you do the work that you have to do?
So it is very important to say that Transparency International is an independent NGO, and maybe that gave it some sort of power and leverage to speak up for all its partners and stakeholders. And having that power of independence that we have and our voice in speaking out and having the principles that we have has given us that kind of reputation that people would listen to us, or organizations and allies would speak to us. And I'm saying this because you need, when you are in a position to speak about the issue of corruption, sometimes you really hit the barrier of the politics, engaging in politics. And it is this thin line between speaking about politics and actually speaking about corruption, and how we are working with the people for the people. And we're working to recommend to governments, to donors, to institutions, to multilateral organizations, to foundations, to say, this is what is needed to be done in 1, 2, 3, 4 countries, or in this agenda. We have our research, we have our methodology. And when we speak about the cost of corruption, it is not about how you prove it just with numbers, which is good, because you can say for every dollar that goes into Yemen as humanitarian aid, $10 go out as stolen assets. So how are you actually dealing with this? We need to reform the system where those $10 that go out do not go out anymore, because the $1 that goes in is affecting people's life, and it could be multiplied, and people can actually feel that. And numbers are good, but if we do not support the numbers and telling them, okay, it's good that you're giving it, CPI is good because Corruption Perception Index, as people use it, for us, it's an index. It is one indicator that gives us how severe that problem is. And one thing that is very important when we go speak to people and we go to people, and this is why we have our national chapters, over 100 chapters around the world that exist in those countries. They reach out to people. They are independent NGOs in their national context that speak for the national agendas. And when you speak to people and say, for example, in Morocco, our advocacy and legal advice centers, you were speaking about whistleblowers, or like those centers where we have in our chapters where people come and report some form of corruption that has happened. For example, in Morocco, in one of those years, a small village in one of the Moroccan areas have reported that women cannot give birth unless they pay a bribe to a certain hospital to go in and deliver their babies. They would deliver at the doors. So it's not a systematic problem. It's actually in one of those grassroots like areas or rural areas where maybe there is not a lot of monitoring the situation and putting hands on. And then when our chapter heard that and then kept monitoring the situation and compiled stories and looked for it and investigated and put it forward for the authorities, you have saved lives of babies that were dying at the door of the hospital because they had to pay bribes for nurses in order to deliver, which is their right in that, or else if they didn't, they would not deliver their babies. So people realize that it's coming down to their own, like, very basic rights of living and their babies' health and the health of the women. And it helped change the agenda. And we've given statistics and we've helped put in place better processes with the government to ensure that this is not happening again across the country. So when you start working on those cases, then that builds trust in your organization, the work that you do. And then people would come forward and say, okay, we have this form of corruption, but we need this recommendation. And then we put that recommendation on a regional level. So recently I was in the high-level forum of Sustainable Development Goals, the Arab Forum, which happened in Beirut. And I was speaking on a panel on the forms of corruption that are affecting our stability in the region. Every day you wake up just waiting to hear, unfortunately, a change or an instability somewhere or an attack somewhere, and you have to be ready to respond to that. That gives you an indicator that the people are not happy and they need that actual change. So our recommendation would be put forward for the UN, for IMF, for the World Bank, for any organization, for the EU that has influence and also have some sort of leverage and speak to those leaders to change the situation. But still, we need to have a political will from inside to change in order for us to guarantee sustainability.
I know part of your mission is to create more democratic practices. Do you find that your work is easier in democracies or in authoritarian governments?
Um, it is I won't say it's a tricky question because, of course, if you work in democracies, it's easier maybe to do some better influence on legal frameworks, on implementation, on impact. But we have seen that some democracies can flip into an authoritarian overnight, which says, okay, did we do the right job in making sure that this does not end up as an authoritarian or more grab on system? Also, there is an issue, and let me put it very frankly and bluntly, and we had also issues in unfolding the terms that we have. So what do we mean by democracy? Does it have a one definition, and how we implement that in systems? Do we just copy paste Western systems into our cultures? Do we create our own democracies from the cultures that we come from, where it can guarantee social accountability, it can guarantee also good systems in place to hold the power to account, but coming from the nations and not copying and pasting it from different systems. And that in itself is also tricky when we speak about it in the region. And personally and professionally from my work, when I speak about democracy, I do not like to give examples of which democracy is better to bring it into our system, because it might not work. You have a different demography. You have a different system in place. The country is not that big. I can't bring the democracy or the system of the US into a small country like Lebanon, for example. Does not work. But it might work in bigger countries where you can have a federal system, for example. So we should be careful in using our words in terms of what is democracy and what's authoritarian. Of course, an authoritarian has its forms of it is difficult to break through. They sometimes, some of those authoritarian regimes want to show that they are doing something good, so they call you to come in. They want to deal with you so that they can have a better reputation. And this is where it makes a bit our work hard, because we do not want to whitewash anyone. We really want to work for the people and not for the systems.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, as countries do invite you in, let's say for to show how much progress they're making towards fighting corruption. Because one of the issues that's on the line is the notion of direct foreign investment. And so, what's been countries' response to you overall? Because they want that direct investment. So, how are countries responding to you when you do point out that, according to your index, they are deemed a corrupt country? I mean, how do they respond to you or to the organization?
Okay, just to clarify. So sometimes we are asked not by governments, but we're asked by the investors themselves or by anyone who wants to invest. What is our perception of corruption in that country, and is it okay to go to go in? And what are the recommendations of acting or taking positions on any form of corruption that they would face in a country, which I have done a few times in speaking about the weaknesses and strengths of systems in some of the countries in the region. But my way towards this is not to cut off that investment opportunity, because at the end of the day, some of those investments might create employment opportunities for people in those countries. So this actually affects the economies. However, it's always recommended to governments, and when we work with governments, on strengthening their investment legal framework, where it can actually protect those investors from any form of corruption, from bribe, or if it is procurement issue, or engaging in exploitation or human rights. Because one of the things that we keep insisting in the region specifically, that human rights abuses, especially if it is coming from in the business sector, sometimes it is part of this whole agenda of fighting corruption, to make sure that human rights are respected in a country. We do not take away the corruption agenda from the human rights agenda. They have to actually be together. So it's always a recommendation to the host government or to the investor to make sure that there are safeguards of corruption when they go in and invest.
Moments we have left, you know, you know the trends. You see the trends of where corruption is going, where it's getting better. Overall, even though you don't want to put everyone in the same basket, but overall, where do you think we will be, let's say 10 years from now, in the sense of corruption in the area of North Africa as well as the Middle East? Keeping in mind that you don't want to put everyone in the same category, but in general, what do you see over the next decade?
Um, there is a change. The change is coming. Positive change is always hoped for, and we're working towards that. And to say it out bluntly, nobody expected the 2010 to happen that soon, or any change to happen in the region that soon. And after that change, several other changes and domino effects here and there in different forms has happened. And stability requires time. If you look at Europe in so many in so many time frames in the past or history, you could see that sometimes any change to stabilize needs probably 25 to 30 years to actually have its ground. And this depends on the generations. And I really feel that then this generation, maybe my kids' generation and their kids, are the ones that are going to do the change, because they're not depending on the traditional tools. I think they have so much opportunity to use the non-traditional tools of change. We're seeing now the effect of technology and artificial intelligence and social media on influencing even the public views. And this whole thing has happened and is happening every day, the development and their innovation. And I don't think the traditional methods are going to keep up with that. I think this is where the change is going to happen for the better. And as long as we're investing properly in their education, in their understanding, in their link to the outside world, I think the whole idea of us being in one globe now, with all the technology and the reach out, you can learn from somebody in Asia something that you can actually adapt and bring it into your country, which can make a change. It's no longer that we're trapped within the information in our own boundaries. The information is there, and I think the new generations are going to do the change. And I am optimistic. I cannot tell you how that will shape. No one would know the shape of that. But I think we will have setbacks, but I think we will have, again, another rise from the setback. And people will have the time to say enough is enough, and we're actually acting upon it.
My guest today has been Kinda Hattar, Regional Advisor for the Middle East and North Africa for Transparency International. Kinda, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
And join us again next week, where we discuss another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.